Clara had always been a patient woman, accustomed to the slow rhythm of life in the countryside. Her days were spent in peaceful solitude, with occasional visits to the town square or Sunday church services, where she would chat with old friends. But that morning, something in her heart felt different, a sharp tug of worry that wouldn't leave her alone. It had been months since she last saw Alice, her only daughter. Although they talked on the phone occasionally, Clara could sense a change in Alice's voice, a weight she couldn't quite place. That unsettling feeling led her to make an impulsive decision. She packed a small suitcase, grabbed her coat, and boarded the early bus to the city. The journey was long, stretching hours through winding roads and crowded highways, but Clara barely noticed. Her mind was focused on Alice, replaying their last conversation over and over. Something wasn't right, but she couldn't figure out what. Alice had always been strong, independent, a young woman who worked tirelessly to build her career in the bustling metropolis. Still, a mother's intuition could never be ignored. Clara knew her daughter better than anyone, and something was troubling her. It was a nagging thought that only seemed to grow louder as she neared the city. When the bus finally pulled into the station, the city's noise and chaos greeted her like an unwelcome guest. Clara adjusted her coat, clutching the small suitcase closer to her chest. She hailed a taxi, giving the driver Alice's address with a hint of hesitation. It had been so long since she visited, she wasn't sure what to expect. The city had always overwhelmed her, with its towering buildings and fast pace. As they approached Alice's apartment building, a sudden sense of unease crept up her spine. The once familiar street seemed different, darker, as if something ominous lingered in the air. Clara stood in front of the tall, modern building that housed Alice's apartment, feeling out of place. The entrance was sleek, with glass doors that reflected the city lights, and a doorman nodded politely as she passed by. She took the elevator to the 12th floor, the soft hum of the machinery doing little to calm her nerves. When she reached Alice's door, she paused for a moment. Her heart was racing, an inexplicable fear gripping her as she raised her hand to knock. The first knock was gentle, almost tentative, but there was no response. Clara waited a few seconds before knocking again, this time a little louder. Still nothing. She must be out, Clara thought, but something didn't feel right. She fumbled for her phone, dialing Alice's number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. "Hi, this is Alice. I can't come to the phone right now, but leave a message and I'll get back to you." Clara sighed, hearing the upbeat tone of her daughter's voice in the recording, a stark contrast to the worry gnawing at her. Clara pressed her ear against the door, listening for any sounds inside. Silence. Her hand moved to the door handle, and to her surprise, it turned easily. The door wasn't locked. Pushing it open slowly, she stepped inside. The air inside the apartment felt stale, as if no one had been there in days. The lights were off, and the only source of illumination came from the faint glow of the city outside, filtering through the blinds. Clara's heart skipped a beat. The apartment, usually spotless and organized, was in disarray. Papers were scattered on the floor. A chair had been knocked over, and the scent of stale food lingered in the air. "Alice," Clara called out, her voice trembling as she walked further into the living room. There was no response, only the eerie quiet that filled the space. She moved towards the kitchen, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of her daughter. The sink was filled with dirty dishes, something Alice would never allow. She was meticulous, always keeping her home clean and tidy. The sight of the mess only deepened Clara's worry. What had happened here? Clara's mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Maybe Alice had left in a hurry, an emergency at work, or perhaps she had gone on a trip and forgotten to tell her. But that didn't explain the state of the apartment. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. Clara walked towards a bedroom, her steps hesitant. The door was slightly ajar, and as she pushed it open, her heart sank. The bed was unmade. Clothes were strewn across the floor, and the closet door was wide open. But what caught Clara's attention was the small, crumpled piece of paper on the nightstand. She picked it up, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. The words written on the page were brief, but they sent a chill down her spine. "I'm sorry. I didn't know what else to do. I'll explain everything soon." Clara's breath caught in her throat. What did Alice mean by this? Where was she? Panic surged through her and she dropped the note, her mind spinning with questions. She rushed back into the living room, searching for any other clues. That's when she noticed a blinking light on Alice's answering machine. It was an old device, one Alice rarely used, preferring her cell phone for messages. But there it was, blinking, indicating there were unheard messages. With shaky hands, Clara pressed the button to play them. The first message was from a few days ago, Alice's boss, reminding her about a meeting. The second message was from a friend, asking if Alice wanted to grab lunch. But the third message, that one made Clara's blood run cold. A man's voice, low and threatening, filled the room. "You can't hide forever, Alice. We know where you are." Clara's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Who was this man? And what did he want with her daughter? The fear that had been simmering inside her now boiled over, turning into full-blown terror. She needed to find Alice, and fast. But where could she have gone? Who was after her? And most importantly, was she safe? Clara didn't have any answers, only more questions. But one thing was certain. She wouldn't stop until she found her daughter. Whatever had happened, whatever trouble Alice had gotten herself into, Clara was determined to help her. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The apartment, once a place of comfort, now felt like the scene of a crime. And Clara was left standing in the middle of it, desperate and afraid. The air in Alice's apartment was thick with a palpable sense of absence. It weighed down on Clara, making every breath feel labored, every movement heavy. She stood frozen for a moment, her eyes scanning the living room, where the overturned chair and scattered papers still seemed to mock her. What had happened here? A mother's mind can conjure endless possibilities, and Clara's thoughts raced through them all. Had Alice been in danger? Had she left of her own accord, or had something worse taken place? She couldn't afford to dwell on those thoughts for too long. She had to act. Clara's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to move. She retraced her steps, going back to Alice's bedroom. The note was still there, a crumpled reminder of the mystery her daughter was now enveloped in. She picked it up again, reading the words over and over, trying to make sense of them. "I'm sorry. I didn't know what else to do. I'll explain everything soon." Explain what? What could Alice possibly be involved in that required such cryptic apologies? Clara knew Alice had always been independent, perhaps even secretive, but this was different. This felt dangerous. With no other clues presenting themselves in the bedroom, Clara walked back into the living room, her eyes drawn once again to the blinking light on the answering machine. The man's voice echoed in her mind. "You can't hide forever, Alice." Who was he? Why was he looking for Alice? And more importantly, how did he know where she lived? Clara's stomach turned at the thought of someone dangerous being that close to her daughter, and she felt a fresh wave of fear wash over her. She couldn't sit by idly. She needed to act. Her first instinct was to call the police. She pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen as she hesitated. What would she tell them? That her daughter had left a strange note and that someone had left a threatening message on the machine? It didn't seem like enough to launch an investigation. And what if Alice was simply hiding for a reason? Perhaps the police getting involved would only make things worse. Clara dropped her phone back into her bag, her mind torn between panic and the desire to protect her daughter's privacy. Instead, Clara decided to search the apartment thoroughly. She started by going through the drawers in the living room. Alice wasn't the type to leave important things lying around, but maybe, just maybe, there would be something, anything, that could explain what was going on. The first few drawers revealed nothing but the usual clutter. Old bills, stationery, and some photographs from a family vacation years ago. Clara paused for a moment, holding one of the photos in her hand. It was from a trip they had taken to the beach when Alice was just a little girl. Her wide smile and bright eyes were captured in the picture, and for a brief moment, Clara felt a pang of nostalgia, a longing for simpler times when the only thing Alice worried about was building sandcastles. But now, the distance between them felt insurmountable, not just physically but emotionally. Clara had always tried to give Alice space to grow into the woman she needed to be, but now she wondered if she had been too distant. Maybe if she had been more involved in Alice's life, she would have known what was going on. Maybe she could have helped before things got so out of control. Shaking off the wave of guilt, Clara placed the photo back in the drawer and continued her search. The next drawer was filled with paperwork, mostly work-related documents. Clara leafed through them quickly, not expecting to find much, but then she noticed something strange. There was an envelope tucked between some papers, and it was addressed to Alice. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and there was no return address. Curiosity piqued. Clara opened the envelope and pulled out the letter inside. The letter was brief, but its contents were chilling. "I know what you did. It's only a matter of time before the truth comes out. You can't run from this forever. You'll pay for what you've done." Clara's hands trembled as she read the words. What had Alice done? The message was vague, but it was clearly a threat. The same icy fear that had been growing inside her now solidified into a knot in her stomach. Alice had been keeping secrets, dangerous ones, and Clara had no idea how deep this went. She placed the letter back in the envelope and tucked it into her pocket. This was something she needed to keep with her. It felt like a key piece of a puzzle she didn't yet understand. As she moved toward the kitchen, Clara's eyes were drawn to the refrigerator. There were several notes and pictures pinned to the door, things Alice had collected over time. Reminders of appointments, a few postcards from friends, and a photo of her and Clara from last Christmas. But one note stood out. It was a shopping list, written in Alice's familiar handwriting, but the last item on the list was scratched out aggressively. Clara squinted, trying to make out the word. It looked like it said medicine. But why would Alice cross it out so violently? It didn't make sense. Clara's heart ached with confusion. Her daughter had clearly been struggling with something bigger than Clara had realized. But what? Was it her work? Had Alice gotten involved with someone dangerous? Clara's mind was spinning with possibilities, none of them good. She turned away from the fridge and opened the kitchen cabinets, searching for anything that could explain the situation further. The cabinets were half empty, another strange sign. Alice always kept her kitchen well-stocked, but now it seemed like she hadn't been home in days, maybe even longer. In the back of one of the cabinets, Clara found an old coffee can. It seemed out of place, as Alice had never been one to drink much coffee. Curious, Clara pulled it out and unscrewed the lid. Inside, she found a small stack of papers, folded and worn from being hidden away. Clara unfolded the first piece of paper and gasped. It was a bank statement, but not from a regular account. It was a foreign account, one Clara had never seen before, and the amount of money listed on it was staggering. Why would Alice have a secret bank account? And why was there so much money in it? Clara's mind raced as she sifted through the rest of the papers. There were receipts for large sums of money, all deposited into the same account. It was clear that Alice had been involved in something that went far beyond a simple misunderstanding. The more Clara uncovered, the more she realized that her daughter had been living a double life. As she stood there, the weight of the discovery settling over her, the phone in the living room rang. The sudden sound startled Clara, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if she should answer it. What if it was that man again, the one who had left a threatening message on the machine? But her curiosity got the better of her. She rushed to the phone and picked it up, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hello?" she said, her voice shaky. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then a familiar voice spoke. "Mom!" It was Alice. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Relief flooded her, but it was quickly replaced by concern. "Alice, where are you? What's going on? I'm at your apartment and..." "I don't have time to explain everything right now," Alice interrupted, her voice low and urgent. "But you need to leave, Mom. You shouldn't be there." Clara's heart sank. "Alice, please, just tell me what's happening. I found your note, and there's this letter, and I can't talk about it right now," Alice said, her voice strained. "It's not safe. Just trust me, okay? I'll explain everything soon, but for now, you need to go. Please, Mom." Before Clara could respond, the line went dead. She stared at the phone in disbelief, her heart racing. Alice was in trouble, real trouble, and Clara had no idea how to help her. But one thing was clear. Whatever was going on, it was far more dangerous than Clara had imagined. Clara's hand trembled as she placed the phone back on its cradle. Alice had sounded terrified, more terrified than Clara had ever heard her. The words echoed in her mind. You shouldn't be there. What was happening to her daughter? Why was she in such grave danger? Clara had so many questions, but no answers. She felt helpless, but there was one thing she knew for certain. She couldn't just leave. Not yet. Not when she had uncovered so little. Alice needed help. And if the authorities were out of the question for now, then Clara would have to rely on herself. Steeling her resolve, Clara took a deep breath. The apartment still felt eerie, and the shadows cast by the dim city lights gave it a haunting atmosphere. Every creak of the floor seemed louder in the suffocating silence. Clara's instincts were at war. Part of her wanted to run out of the door, find the nearest police station, and beg for assistance. The other part, the stronger, more maternal part, knew that she had to stay and piece together this puzzle herself. She owed that much to Alice. She walked back into the bedroom, where the note still lay on the bedside table. Clara picked it up again, reading it for what felt like the 100th time. "I didn't know what else to do. I'll explain everything soon." The words gnawed at her. What was Alice caught up in that had forced her to leave such a cryptic message? Clara's gaze drifted toward the closet, and she noticed something she had missed before. There was a black duffel bag lying on the floor, half hidden beneath a pile of clothes. She knelt down and pulled the bag out into the open. It was heavier than she expected. Unzipping it, Clara's breath hitched. Inside were bundles of cash, neatly stacked and wrapped in rubber bands. It was more money than Clara had ever seen in her life. Her heart pounded as she tried to make sense of it. Alice had never mentioned anything about money. Certainly not this kind of money. Where had it come from? And more importantly, why was it hidden? Clara's mind raced through the possibilities. Could this have something to do with the threatening letter she had found earlier? The bank account? The foreign receipts? The discovery of the duffel bag only deepened the mystery. She carefully zipped the bag back up, her hands shaking slightly. This was no ordinary situation. Whatever Alice was involved in, it was big. Clara couldn't help but wonder if her daughter had gotten in over her head. Determined to find more answers, Clara continued her search. She rifled through the papers on Alice's desk, hoping to uncover something that could explain the money. Most of the documents were related to Alice's work, contracts, emails, project details, but one folder stood out. It was marked with a red label and stamped with the words confidential. Clara hesitated for a moment, unsure whether she should open it, but her curiosity and her need to protect her daughter overpowered her hesitation. Inside the folder were several pages of what appeared to be legal documents. Clara skimmed through them quickly, her brow furrowing as she read. The papers detailed a lawsuit involving Alice's company and a major corporation overseas. It seemed Alice had been working on the case for months, but something about it didn't sit right with Clara. The language in the documents was vague, and there were several references to a settlement that didn't add up. Clara wasn't a lawyer, but she knew enough to realize that something was off. As she read further, she came across an email exchange between Alice and one of her colleagues. The messages were brief, but hinted at a cover-up within the company. Clara's heart sank as she realized the gravity of the situation. Alice had uncovered something she wasn't supposed to, and now, it seemed, she was paying the price for it. Clara put the papers down, her mind spinning. The lawsuit, the money, the threatening letter, it was all connected. But how? And more importantly, what had Alice done with this information? Had she gone to the authorities? Or was she planning to take matters into her own hands? Clara didn't know the answers, but she was beginning to understand why her daughter had left in such a hurry. Just as Clara was about to return the folder to its place, she noticed something else tucked inside, an address written in Alice's handwriting. It was scrawled on the back of an old business card, almost as if Alice had written it in a hurry. Clara's pulse quickened as she read the address. It wasn't far from the apartment, maybe a 20-minute drive. She didn't recognize the location, but it seemed important. Why else would Alice have written it down? Without thinking twice, Clara grabbed the card and stuffed it into her pocket. She needed to go there. It was the only lead she had, and maybe, just maybe, it would bring her closer to finding Alice. As she prepared to leave, Clara cast one last glance around the apartment. The duffel bag still lay where she had found it, and the papers on the desk were scattered from her search. It felt wrong to leave without cleaning up, but there was no time. Alice was in danger, and Clara had to act fast. She left the apartment quietly, locking the door behind her. The hallway outside was eerily quiet, and Clara couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She quickened her pace, her footsteps echoing down the corridor as she made her way to the elevator. Her heart pounded in her chest, and every sound seemed amplified in the empty building. When Clara finally reached the street, she hailed a cab and gave the driver the address from the business card. The driver nodded and pulled into traffic, navigating through the busy city streets with ease. Clara stared out the window, her mind racing with thoughts of Alice. Was she safe? What kind of trouble had she gotten herself into? And most importantly, why hadn't she told Clara sooner? The cab ride felt like an eternity, but eventually they pulled up in front of an old, run-down building. Clara paid the driver and stepped out onto the sidewalk, her eyes scanning the area. The building didn't look like much, just a plain, brick structure with boarded-up windows and faded graffiti. But the address matched the one on the card. This was the place. Clara hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should turn back. But the thought of Alice in danger spurred her forward. She approached the building cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The front door was slightly ajar, and Clara pushed it open slowly, peering inside. The interior was dark and musty, with only a few slivers of light filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. As she stepped inside, Clara's senses were on high alert. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under her weight. She moved carefully, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of life. There were old chairs and tables scattered around, as if the building had once been used as an office or a meeting space. But now, it was abandoned. Clara's pulse quickened as she ventured further into the building. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she knew that this place held some kind of answer. As she reached the back of the room, she noticed a door slightly ajar, just like the front entrance. With trembling hands, she pushed it open and stepped inside. The room beyond was small and dimly lit, with only a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. But what caught Clara's attention wasn't the room itself. It was a figure standing in the corner, a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a menacing presence, stood there, watching her. Clara's breath caught in her throat as their eyes met. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The man didn't respond at first. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." Clara's blood ran cold at the sound of his voice. It was the same voice from the answering machine, the same man who had threatened Alice. "What do you want from my daughter?" Clara asked, her voice rising with a mixture of fear and anger. The man took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your daughter made a mistake," he said slowly, "and now she's going to pay for it." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. She had walked straight into the lion's den, and now she had to find a way out. Clara's body went stiff as the man's words echoed in the small, dimly lit room. The space around her felt suffocating, every breath a struggle as the gravity of the situation began to sink in. The man's eyes were cold, unfeeling, and his presence filled the room like a shadow creeping across the floor. He stepped forward slowly, and Clara took a small, instinctive step back, her heart racing in her chest. "What mistake?" Clara managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. She had to know. She needed to understand what Alice had done to get herself into such dangerous territory. Fear gripped her tightly, but her resolve remained strong. This was her daughter they were talking about, and Clara wasn't about to back down, no matter how scared she was. The man smirked, though there was no humor in his expression. "Your daughter thought she could outsmart us," he said, his voice low and menacing. "She thought she could play both sides, take what wasn't hers and walk away. But no one gets away with that. Not without consequences." Clara's mind raced. What was he talking about? Was it the money? The foreign bank account? The lawsuit? Her thoughts spun in a dizzying loop, trying to piece together the fragments of information she had uncovered over the past few hours. "I don't understand," Clara said, her voice more firm this time. "What does Alice have to do with any of this?" The man chuckled darkly. "You really don't know, do you? She kept you out of it, thinking she was protecting you. But now you're here, and that changes everything." Clara's blood ran cold at his words. She could feel the weight of the threat hanging in the air. Her presence had indeed changed something, and not for the better. She had walked into a trap without realizing it, but there was no turning back now. She had to find a way out, for herself and for Alice. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could help her. The room was sparse, with only a few pieces of old furniture and the single light bulb flickering overhead. There were no windows, no clear exits besides the door she had come through. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, and she knew she had to think fast. "What do you want from her?" Clara asked, trying to keep the conversation going, hoping to buy herself some time to think. "She's my daughter. I deserve to know what's happening." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a colder, more calculating expression. "What I want is simple. I want what she took from us. I want her to pay for the mess she's made." Clara's breath caught in her throat. What did she take? Is this about the money? The man's eyes narrowed. The money is part of it, yes, but it's not just about the cash. It's about the information. Your daughter got too close to something she shouldn't have, and now she thinks she can use it to her advantage. Clara's heart sank. Alice had been in over her head, and now she was in serious trouble. The documents Clara had found in the apartment, the lawsuit, the foreign accounts. It all started to make sense. Alice had discovered something dangerous, and now these people were after her because of it. But Clara still didn't know the full extent of the danger her daughter was in. "What kind of information?" Clara asked, her voice trembling slightly. The man stared at her for a long moment, as if deciding whether or not to answer. Finally, he spoke. "Your daughter found something she shouldn't have in those legal documents, something that could ruin us, and she thought she could use it as leverage to get out. But no one gets out, not unless we say so." Clara's stomach turned. Alice had uncovered some kind of corruption, something illegal, and now these people were hunting her because of it. Clara felt a surge of anger rise within her. How dare they threaten her daughter? How dare they put her in this kind of danger? But the fear was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, reminding Clara that she was out of her depth. "What do you plan to do with her?" Clara asked, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her insides. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering his answer. "That depends on her. She has a choice to make. Return what she took and keep her mouth shut, or face the consequences. But she's running out of time. And now that you're here, the stakes just got higher." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She had put herself in danger by coming here, but she wouldn't regret it. If Alice was in trouble, Clara would do whatever it took to help her. "Where is she?" Clara demanded. I need to see her." The man's eyes gleamed with amusement. "You think you're in a position to make demands?" he said, his tone mocking. "You're lucky I haven't dealt with you already." Clara's heart skipped a beat. The danger she was in was real, and she could feel the weight of the man's threat hanging in the air. But she couldn't leave without knowing where Alice was. She couldn't give up now. "Please," Clara said, her voice softening, desperation creeping in. "She's my daughter. I just want to help her." For a moment, the man's expression shifted, as if some small part of him understood Clara's plea. But it was gone just as quickly as it appeared. He shook his head. "It's too late for that. She made her choice. Now she has to live with it." Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let this man see her break down. She had to stay strong. "For Alice, what if I help you?" Clara said, the words tumbling out before she could stop herself. "I'll find her. I'll talk to her. I'll get her to return whatever it is you want. Just please don't hurt her." The man studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he considered her offer. Finally, he spoke. "You do that? You'd betray your own daughter to save her." Clara's chest tightened. The very thought of betraying Alice made her sick to her stomach. But if it was the only way to keep her safe, she would do it. She had to do it. "If it means keeping her alive," Clara said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Then yes." The man's smirk returned, but this time it was colder, more calculating. "All right," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "I'll give you one chance. But if you fail, both of you will pay the price." Clara's heart pounded in her chest as the gravity of his words sank in. She had no choice but to agree. "Where is she?" Clara asked again, her voice barely a whisper. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He handed it to Clara, his eyes locked on hers. "She's been hiding out here," he said, his tone casual, as if he were giving directions to a grocery store. "But I wouldn't take too long. She's running out of time." Clara took the paper with trembling hands, her heart pounding as she looked at the address scrawled on it. It wasn't far from the apartment, just a few blocks away. She could be there within minutes. But as she turned to leave, the man's voice stopped her. "One more thing," he said, his tone cold and final. "If you tell anyone about this, anyone at all, there won't be a place you can hide. You and your daughter will both disappear." Clara swallowed hard, her throat dry as sand. She nodded, unable to speak. The man's words hung over her like a death sentence. She was in deep now, deeper than she had ever imagined, and there was no turning back. Without another word, Clara left the building, her heart pounding as she stepped out into the cool night air. Her mind raced as she clutched a piece of paper in her hand. She had a location now, a place where Alice might be hiding. But the danger was greater than ever. Clara knew that her next move could be her last. She hailed a taxi, her thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm of fear and determination. Alice was so close, yet still so far out of reach. Clara had to get to her before it was too late. The weight of the man's threat pressed down on her, but she couldn't let it paralyze her. She had to act, for Alice, for herself. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, Clara's mind focused on one thing: finding her daughter and saving her, no matter the cost. Clara's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts as the taxi sped through the dimly lit streets of the city. The address the man had given her was clutched tightly in her hand. The crumpled piece of paper, a tangible reminder of how much danger she and Alice were in. Her heart raced as she replayed the man's cold voice in her head, his threat looming over her like a dark cloud. "If you tell anyone, you'll both disappear." It was a warning she couldn't ignore, but at the same time, she couldn't afford to let fear stop her now. She was so close to finding Alice, so close to saving her daughter. The city's lights flickered past the taxi's windows as Clara tried to calm the panic rising inside her. The weight of the decision she had made, to help these dangerous people in order to save Alice, was crushing. She had never imagined she would be forced into such a position, where the safety of her own daughter rested on a deal with a man who had no regard for human life. But Clara knew she couldn't back out now. She had promised herself that she would do whatever it took to protect Alice, and she meant it. The taxi came to a stop in front of an old building, much like the one she had just left. It was run down, the paint peeling from the walls, and the windows were dirty, as though no one had cleaned them in years. It didn't seem like the kind of place Alice would hide, but Clara knew better than to trust appearances at this point. She paid the driver and stepped out into the cool night air, the sound of the city humming around her. Clara took a deep breath and looked at the piece of paper again, double-checking the address. This was it. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she approached the building. The door was slightly ajar, much like the one at the previous building, and Clara's stomach twisted with anxiety. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if this was the right decision. But she didn't have time to doubt herself. She had to find Alice. She had to make sure her daughter was safe. Pushing the door open, Clara stepped inside. The interior of the building was as unwelcoming as its exterior, dark, musty, and silent. The faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, and the floorboards creaked under her feet as she walked further into the room. There was no sign of anyone else. Clara's nerves were on edge, her senses heightened by the fear that something or someone was lurking in the shadows. "Hello," Clara called out softly, her voice trembling slightly. There was no response, only the deafening silence of the empty building. Her footsteps echoed as she made her way down a narrow hallway, her eyes scanning every corner for any sign of life. The address had brought her here, but where was Alice? Just as Clara was about to turn back, she heard a faint noise coming from one of the rooms at the end of the hall. It was soft, almost like a whisper, but it was enough to send a jolt of hope through her. She quickened her pace, her heart racing with anticipation. Could it be Alice? Was she finally going to find her daughter? As Clara reached the door, she hesitated once more, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, and then pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small lamp in the corner. And there, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, was Alice. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had finally found her. Alice looked exhausted, her face pale and her eyes tired, as if she hadn't slept in days. Her clothes were wrinkled, and there were dark circles under her eyes. But despite her worn appearance, Clara could see the relief in her daughter's eyes as they met. "Mom!" Alice's voice was weak, but it was filled with disbelief. She hadn't expected to see her mother here. Not in this place, not under these circumstances. "Alice!" Clara whispered, her voice breaking as she rushed forward and knelt beside her daughter. She pulled Alice into a tight embrace, tears welling up in her eyes. "Oh, my God, Alice. I've been so worried about you." Alice clung to her mother for a moment before pulling back slightly, her expression filled with guilt and fear. "Mom, you shouldn't be here. It's too dangerous. I told you to stay away." Clara shook her head, her hands gently cupping Alice's face. "I couldn't just stay away, not after what I found in your apartment. You're in trouble, Alice, and I need to know what's going on." Alice looked away, her eyes filled with shame. "I didn't want you to get involved. I thought I could handle it on my own, but I messed up, Mom. I messed up big time." Clara's heart ached as she looked at her daughter. The strong, independent young woman she had raised now looked so fragile, so vulnerable. "Tell me," Clara said softly. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." Alice hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to confide in her mother. Finally, she sighed and began to speak. "It started with my job. I was working on a big case, one that involved a lot of money, a lot of powerful people. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I started noticing things. Documents that didn't make sense, transactions that didn't add up. I started digging deeper, and that's when I realized what was really going on." Clara listened intently, her heart sinking as Alice continued. "The company I was working for, they were involved in something illegal. Money laundering, fraud, all kinds of things. I found evidence, but I couldn't go to the police. They had people on the inside. If I reported it, they'd know, and they'd come after me. So, I tried to leave quietly. I thought if I just disappeared, they wouldn't come after me. But I was wrong. Clara's hands tightened around Alice's. That's why they're after you, isn't it? That man who left a message on your answering machine, he's one of them, isn't he? Alice nodded, her expression grim. Yeah, they found out I was trying to leave, and now they want what I took, the evidence. I thought I could use it as leverage, but it's only made things worse. Clara's mind raced. The money, the lawsuit, the threats, it all made sense now. Alice had uncovered something dangerous, something that powerful people were willing to kill for. But you still have the evidence, don't you? Clara asked, her voice filled with urgency. Alice hesitated for a moment before nodding. I do. It's hidden, but they're getting closer. I don't know how much longer I can keep it safe. Clara's heart pounded. This was worse than she had imagined. Alice wasn't just in trouble. She was in grave danger. And now, so was Clara. She had to think fast. We need to get out of here, Clara said, her voice firm. We need to find a safe place where they can't reach us. But Alice shook her head, her expression filled with despair. There's nowhere to run, Mom. They have eyes everywhere. No matter where we go, they'll find us. Clara refused to accept that. She had come too far to give up now. We'll figure something out, she insisted. There has to be a way out of this. Alice looked at her mother, her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. I don't know, Mom. I don't know if we can outrun them. Clara squeezed Alice's hands tightly, her determination unwavering. We'll find a way, she said softly. I promise you, we'll find a way. But as the words left her lips, a sudden noise from outside the room sent a jolt of fear through Clara's chest. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing down the hallway. Someone was coming. Alice's eyes widened in terror, and Clara's heart raced. They were out of time. We have to go, Clara whispered urgently, pulling Alice to her feet. Now, Alice nodded, her face pale with fear, and together they hurried toward the door. But as they stepped into the hallway, they were met with the sight of a shadowy figure standing at the end of the corridor. The man's silhouette was unmistakable, broad-shouldered and menacing. It was the same man from before, the one who had threatened Clara. You didn't think you could just walk away, did you? The man's voice was cold, his words dripping with malice. Clara's blood ran cold. They were trapped. The shadowy figure stood at the end of the dim corridor, his presence filling the space with an overwhelming sense of dread. Clara's heart pounded, and she could feel Alice trembling beside her. The man's voice had been cold, filled with the promise of danger. They were out of time, and there was no room for mistakes. Clara's instincts kicked in. She had to protect Alice, no matter the cost. Clara's eyes darted around, looking for an escape route. The narrow hallway stretched out before them, and there was nowhere to go but forward. They couldn't turn back now, not with the man standing in their path. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she tried to think, her mind racing. There had to be another way out. There had to be something she could do to keep Alice safe. Stay behind me, Clara whispered to Alice, her voice barely audible. She could feel her daughter's grip tighten on her arm, and she knew that Alice was terrified. But Clara wouldn't let fear control her. She had to be strong for both of them. The man took a step forward, his eyes locked on Clara and Alice. The hallway was too narrow for them to slip past him, and Clara knew that they couldn't outrun him. The only way out was through. She glanced over her shoulder and saw a door to her left, partially hidden in the shadows. It was their only chance. Go, Clara whispered, pushing Alice toward the door. Get through that door, now. Alice hesitated for a moment, her eyes wide with fear, but she did as her mother said. She slipped through the door, and Clara followed close behind, pulling it shut just as the man lunged forward. Clara locked the door and leaned her weight against it, her heart pounding as she heard the man pounding on the other side. Run, Alice. Clara urged, her voice trembling. "Find a way out." Alice's eyes were filled with panic, but she nodded and turned. Sprinting down the dark room, Clara pushed herself away from the door and followed her daughter, her heart racing as she heard the sound of wood splintering behind her. The man was trying to break through, and they didn't have much time. The room they had entered was cluttered with old, abandoned furniture and boxes stacked haphazardly against the walls. Clara's eyes scanned the space for an exit. She spotted a narrow staircase in the corner of the room, leading up to what looked like an old attic. It wasn't an ideal escape, but it was the only option they had. "Up the stairs," Clara called out, grabbing Alice's hand and pulling her toward the staircase. They climbed quickly, their footsteps echoing in the empty room below. Clara's heart pounded as they reached the top, and she pushed open the attic door, ushering Alice inside. The attic was dark, the only light coming from a small, grimy window at the far end. Dust filled the air, and the wooden floor creaked beneath their weight. Clara could hear the sound of the door below breaking open, and her heart clenched with fear. They were running out of time. "We need to hide," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. She scanned the attic, her eyes searching for a place where they could conceal themselves. There was a large wooden wardrobe in the corner, its door slightly ajar. It was big enough for both of them to fit inside. Clara pulled Alice toward it, opening the door and guiding her inside. They climbed into the wardrobe, and Clara pulled the door shut behind them, plunging them into darkness. The air inside was stale, and Clara could hear Alice's shaky breathing beside her. She reached out, taking her daughter's hand and squeezing it tightly. They had to stay quiet. They had to stay hidden. The attic was silent, save for the sound of their breathing and the occasional creak of the old wooden beams. Clara strained her ears, listening for any sign of the man. She could hear footsteps below, slow and deliberate, as if he was searching for them. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. Minutes felt like hours as they waited in the darkness, every creak of the attic floor making Clara's pulse quicken. She prayed that the man wouldn't find them, that they could wait him out until he gave up. But deep down, she knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. They had to find a way out, and soon. The footsteps grew louder, and Clara's heart nearly stopped when she heard them ascending the stairs. The man was coming closer. Clara held her breath, her grip on Alice's hand tightening. She could feel her daughter trembling beside her, and she whispered a silent prayer, hoping they would make it out of this alive. The attic door creaked open, and Clara heard the man's footsteps as he entered. He moved slowly, as if he knew they were hiding somewhere close by. Clara's entire body tense, her eyes squeezing shut in the darkness of the wardrobe. She could hear the man moving around the attic, his heavy footsteps echoing in the confined space. Suddenly, the wardrobe door burst open and light flooded in. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she came face to face with the man. His eyes were cold, his expression twisted in anger. He grabbed Clara by the arm, yanking her out of the wardrobe with a force that sent her stumbling to the ground. "Please don't hurt her," Alice cried out, her voice filled with desperation as she struggled against the man's grip. Clara's heart broke at the sound of her daughter's fear, but she couldn't give up now. She had to fight. With every ounce of strength she had left, Clara lunged forward, grabbing the man's arm and trying to pull him away from Alice. The man was strong, his grip like iron, but Clara refused to let go. She kicked and struggled, her determination fueled by her love for her daughter. The commotion caused the man to lose his balance for a moment, and Clara used the opportunity to push him away. "Run, Alice," she shouted, her voice filled with urgency. "Get out of here." Alice hesitated, her eyes filled with tears, but she knew she had to listen to her mother. She turned and ran toward the attic window, her heart pounding as she pushed it open. The cool night air rushed in, and Alice climbed through the window, scrambling onto the roof. Clara fought to keep the man at bay, her body aching from the struggle. She could feel her strength waning, but she refused to give up. She had to buy Alice enough time to get away. The man growled in frustration, his eyes filled with rage as he finally managed to push Clara to the ground. Clara hit the floor hard, pain radiating through her body, but she forced herself to look up. She saw Alice on the roof, her silhouette illuminated by the moonlight. Clara's heart swelled with pride and fear all at once. Her daughter was getting away, and that was all that mattered. The man turned his attention to the window, but Clara knew she couldn't let him go after Alice. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Clara lunged at the man, wrapping her arms around his legs and pulling him back. The man stumbled, his balance thrown off, and he fell to the ground with a thud. "Go, Alice," Clara shouted, her voice breaking. "Go now." Alice looked back, her eyes wide with fear, but she nodded. She turned and began to climb down the side of the building, her heart pounding with every movement. Clara watched as her daughter disappeared from view, her heart filled with a mix of relief and terror. The man pushed Clara away, his face twisted in anger. He got to his feet, his eyes locking onto Clara with a cold, unforgiving glare. "You're going to regret that," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Clara knew she was in danger, but she didn't care. Alice was safe, and that was all that mattered. She looked up at the man, her eyes filled with defiance. "You'll never find her," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The man's expression darkened, and he stepped closer, his hand reaching for something in his pocket. Clara's heart pounded, but she refused to show fear. She had done what she needed to do. She had protected her daughter, and whatever happened next, she was ready to face it. Clara's vision blurred as she looked up at the man standing over her, his face a mask of cold fury. Pain pulsed through her body, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had given Alice the chance she needed to escape, and that thought was the only thing keeping Clara going. She knew she had to buy more time to make sure Alice was well away from this place. The man took a step closer, his eyes locked on Clara. He pulled something out of his pocket, a switchblade. The metallic click echoed through the attic as the blade snapped open, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. She tried to push herself up, but her body ached from the struggle. The man's cold eyes met hers, and he smirked, the blade glinting in the dim light. "You've caused me a lot of trouble tonight," he said, his voice low and menacing. "But this ends now." Clara's heart pounded in her chest, her fear spiking as the man moved closer. But just as he raised the knife, a sudden, loud noise echoed from the lower floor, an urgent pounding, followed by the crash of the front door being forced open. The man froze, his head snapping around toward the source of the noise. Clara's heart skipped a beat, hope blossoming inside her. Someone was here. "Police, drop your weapon." A voice shouted from below, and Clara's heart soared. The police had found them. She had no idea how they knew to come here, but it didn't matter. Help had arrived. The man's face twisted in frustration, and he hesitated, the knife still in his hand. Clara could hear the heavy footsteps of the officers as they charged up the stairs, their voices echoing through the building. The man glanced back at Clara, his eyes filled with rage. He knew his time was up. With a growl of frustration, the man turned and sprinted toward the window, his footsteps echoing through the attic. Clara watched as he climbed out, disappearing into the night, just as the police officers burst through the attic door, their guns drawn. "Ma'am, are you all right?" one of the officers asked as they rushed toward her, their eyes scanning the room for any remaining threats. Clara nodded, tears welling in her eyes as the tension in her body finally began to release. I'm okay," she managed to say, her voice breaking. "But my daughter, Alice, she's out there. You have to find her." The officers helped Clara to her feet, one of them speaking into his radio, calling for backup and describing the suspect who had just fled through the window. Clara's legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stand, her heart pounding with worry for Alice. She had no idea where her daughter had gone, but she prayed that Alice was safe. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," one of the officers said, his voice gentle. "We'll make sure you're safe, and we'll do everything we can to find your daughter." Clara nodded, her eyes filled with tears. She allowed the officers to lead her out of the attic, her mind racing with thoughts of Alice. She couldn't lose hope now, not when they had come so far. As they made their way down the stairs, Clara's thoughts drifted to Alice, her brave, determined daughter who had risked everything to do the right thing. Clara knew that Alice had been trying to protect her, to keep her out of harm's way, but she also knew that they were stronger together. They had faced danger, and they had survived. Now, they just had to find each other again. The officers led Clara out of the building, and she blinked as the bright lights of the police cars outside flooded her vision. The street was filled with activity, officers moving back and forth, radios crackling, and the flashing lights of emergency vehicles casting shadows across the pavement. Clara took a deep breath, the cool night air filling her lungs as she tried to steady herself. "Ma'am, we're going to take you to the station," one of the officers said, his voice calm and reassuring. "We'll need to take your statement, and we'll continue searching for your daughter. We've got units looking for the suspect now." Clara nodded, her heart aching with worry for Alice. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling. She allowed the officers to guide her to one of the waiting patrol cars, her eyes scanning the street, hoping for any sign of her daughter. As she sat in the back of the patrol car, Clara's mind raced. She thought of everything that had led them to this moment. The strange phone calls, the threats, the discovery of the evidence that had put Alice in danger. It all seemed like a nightmare, something out of a movie, but it was real. And despite everything, Clara knew they had to keep fighting. She had to find Alice, and they had to find a way to put an end to this nightmare once and for all. The ride to the police station was a blur. Clara stared out the window, her thoughts consumed by her daughter. She couldn't shake the image of Alice climbing out of the attic window, her face filled with fear and determination. Clara knew that Alice was strong, stronger than she had ever realized. But the thought of her daughter out there, alone and in danger, made Clara's heart ache. When they arrived at the station, the officers helped Clara out of the car and led her inside. The station was bustling with activity, officers moving quickly, phones ringing, and voices echoing through the space. Clara was taken to a small room where she was offered a cup of water and asked to wait. She sat down, her hands trembling slightly as she took a sip of the water. She had to stay strong for Alice. A few minutes later, a detective entered the room, his expression kind but serious. He introduced himself as Detective Harris and sat down across from Clara. "Ma'am, I understand you've been through a lot tonight," he said, his voice gentle. "But I need you to tell me everything you know about what's been going on. It's important that we have all the information so we can find your daughter and keep both of you safe." Clara took a deep breath, her mind racing as she tried to gather her thoughts. She began to tell Detective Harris everything, from the moment she had arrived at Alice's apartment to the threats, the evidence, and the events that had led them to the attic. The detective listened intently, taking notes as Clara spoke, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When Clara finished, Detective Harris nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "Thank you, ma'am. You've been very brave tonight, and we're going to do everything we can to find your daughter and make sure both of you are safe. We're already working on tracking down the suspect, and we have units searching the area where your daughter was last seen." Clara nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice breaking. "Please, just find her. She's all I have." Detective Harris gave her a reassuring smile. "We will, ma'am. I promise you, we won't stop until we find her." Hours passed, and Clara remained at the station, her heart heavy with worry. She couldn't rest, couldn't think of anything but Alice. The officers had been kind, offering her coffee and blankets, but nothing could ease the ache in her heart. She sat in the waiting area, her eyes fixed on the door, hoping with every passing moment that Alice would walk through it. Just as the first light of dawn began to break through the windows, the door to the station opened and Clara's heart leaped. There, standing in the doorway, was Alice. Her clothes were dirty, her face streaked with tears, but she was alive. Clara jumped to her feet, her heart swelling with relief as she rushed toward her daughter. "Alice!" Clara cried, tears streaming down her face as she pulled her daughter into a tight embrace. "Oh, thank God, you're safe." Alice clung to her mother, her own tears falling freely. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to get involved in this." Clara pulled back slightly, her hands gently cupping Alice's face. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "All that matters is that you're safe. We'll get through this together, I promise you." Alice nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude and love. She looked over her mother's shoulder and saw Detective Harris approaching, his expression one of relief. "Miss, I'm Detective Harris," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm glad you're safe. We're going to take your statement and do everything we can to make sure those responsible are brought to justice." Alice nodded, her eyes meeting the detective's. "I have the evidence," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Everything they've done, I have proof. I want to help." Detective Harris nodded, his expression serious. "That's very brave of you, Mississippi. We'll make sure you're protected, and we'll use everything you have to bring them down." Clara looked at her daughter, her heart swelling with pride. Despite everything they had been through, Alice was still determined to do the right thing. Clara knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they would face it together. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. As the first rays of sunlight filled the station, Clara held Alice close, her heart filled with a mix of relief and hope. They had survived the night, and now, together, they would fight for a better future. Enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.